2, 1.
Good morning. Today is Wednesday, September 28th, 2022. This is the Arlington County, Virginia Board of Equalization hearing. There are 6 cases on the agenda today. We're starting with the first, RPC 1700202. It's Economic Unit on Fairfax Drive, and Mr. Jordan Harmon is here on behalf of the owner and will present the case. Mr. Harmon, you can start with your 8 minutes and tell us about this property.
Yes, thank you. Madam Chairwoman, members of the board, members of the county, good morning. This property is located at 1616 North Fort Myer Drive, and it's also known as the Roslyn Overlook. This property is featured prominently. If you come out of DC on Highway 50, you'll see it off to the right. It's got its address prominently displayed, 1616 North Fort Myer Drive. It's a 300,000 square foot building that is 47 years old. If you'd be so kind, I'd like to start by directing your attention to the reported NOI at the property over the past 4 years. You can see that the property posted the high water mark back in 2018. Then NOI dropped significantly the next year. This drop is attributable to 2 large tenants vacating. One tenant vacated in March of 2019, vacating 58,000 square feet. Another tenant vacated in May of 2018. This was an additional 19,000 square feet. For the past 3 years, NOI has averaged $4.5 million, which drops to only $4.17 million over the past 2 years. The decrease in NOI coincides with the increase in vacancy, from 29% vacant in 2018 to 47% vacant the past 3 years. The issues on appeal are the vacant office rental rate, the operating expense rate, and the lease-up cost. First, I'd like to discuss the in-place office rental rates. 90% of the lease space at this property began their leases in 2006 or earlier, so the current rental rates are very much out of date and not indicative of the current market for this property. GSA leases 41% of the building on leases that began in 2006 or earlier, which is also not indicative of the current market rates. GSA's leases for 41% of the NLA are set to expire in May of 2024, which would increase the vacancy by 41% and result in an overall vacancy rate of 88% for this property. Even though these rates for in-place leases are above market and set to expire, the in-place lease rate is what we have imputed on the occupied office space on our pro forma. Now, for the vacant office space, the county imputes rents at $35 per square foot. This is above what the market will pay for space in this building, as indicated by the most recent leasing activity. The most recent leases at the property began in 2020 and had a base rate of only $36.35, which required an average of 7.4% in concessions to obtain. This rate of concessions, as we've seen on prior cases, is low based on what the market was offering as of January 1, 2022. However, factoring in the actual concessions on these 2020 leases, we get to a net effective rental rate of only $33.68 per square foot. The office market in Roslyn has fallen further since these 2020 leases were signed, which is where the appealed value of $32 per square foot is arrived at. This factors in the increased concessions that we've seen on other properties throughout the county in 2021. But again, even if we just take the standard 6% concessions to the base rent of these most recent leases, we get to a vacant office rental rate of only $34.17 per square foot, not the $35 the county has imputed. This property is outdated and dilapidated. It does not show well on its own, but especially not in light of the superior space that is available elsewhere in Roslyn for comparable rates. The building is at that awkward point where Roslyn begins to change grades, with the entrance somewhat hidden and difficult to access. $32 per square foot is an optimistic estimate of what the property can host to lease up the 40% of the vacant space for. Next, the operating expenses imputed by the assessment are not representative of what the property can expect to incur at the 75% stabilized occupancy that we've used on the assessment. Just as we have imputed income to vacant space to attain a stabilized income stream, we must also impute operating expenses at a rate indicative of a 75% occupied building. Fortunately, we can look at the operating history at this property to see what expenses would be at a stabilized occupancy. This property was operating at 71% occupancy in 2017 and 2018. During these 2 years, operating expenses were $12.27 and $12.33 per square foot. The assessment assumes in 2022 that the property will incur only $12 per square foot in operating expenses at stabilized occupancy. This is clearly not logical given the impacts of inflation from the time the property was stabilized in 2017 and 18 to the current data value. If we grow the 2018 operating expense rate, again, $12.33 per square foot at 71% occupancy, by a nominal 3% interest over 4 years, this results in an operating expense rate closer to $14 per square foot. Keep in mind, too, that this property has been 41% occupied by GSA. GSA leases typically handle a portion of their operating expenses directly, which results in the property reporting lower operating expenses than an office building would that was occupied by typical market tenants. Alternatively, we can look at the variable expenses per occupied square foot that were incurred in 2021 and see that if we treat the excess vacancy the same for expenses as we do for income, the impact of leasing the additional 22% of NLA to get to the 75% stabilized occupancy is an increase in operating expenses of over $575,000. Finally, the assessment fails to account for the time the property will require to reach stabilized occupancy, as well as the tenant improvements that will need to be given to potential new tenants. Now, we've heard from the county on prior cases that assessments are annual, and that to increase the absorption period beyond 1 year lease-up is not how they assess properties. However, this is the case when properties have excess vacancy greater than 100,000 square feet. When a property has vacancy greater than 100,000 square feet, the county will apply a second year of lease-up deductions to the amount of vacant space that's above that 100,000 square foot threshold. Clearly, the county agrees that a second year of lease-up cost is appropriate in certain instances, since the assessments on these types of properties do just that. They apply a second year of lost rent deductions. On this assessment, the county is asserting the excess vacant space will lease up in only 1 year. This building is being treated differently than buildings with vacancy greater than 100,000 square feet. This approach also values each building in a bubble, failing to account for the fact that each building is in fact in competition with every other building in the county that has vacant space. As of the first of the year, there were over 9 million square feet of vacant office space available for lease in the county. To summarize, the assessment arrives at a value in excess of fair market value by overstating the potential rent the vacant space can lease for, undercounting the operating expenses required to operate the building at stabilized occupancy, and the assessment does not account for the lease-up costs that will be associated with tenanting the building. Just to reiterate what I stated at the beginning, for the past 3 years, NOI has averaged $4.5 million and only $4.17 million over the past 2 years. As such, taxpayer respectfully requests that the assessment be reduced as set forth in the appeal. Thank you. And Eileen, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I do not. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Perfect timing. Mr. Peralta for the county, please.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. For this case, we did look at the rent roll that was submitted. I believe we're close with the appellant's pro forma stating the leases in place average rent. When we look at the vacant office, we looked at CoStar and we saw what they were asking for the rent. It's $39 per square foot. That's located on page 7 of the packet. This property is 2 blocks from the metro. I believe Mr. Harmon stated that their average was closer to 34.17. When you add in all the other factors, they are using a $32 per square foot rate in their pro forma. The range in Roslyn, when we look at the guidelines, goes up to $65 a square foot. Again, we're at $39 a square foot based on CoStar. When you look at the expenses, even if you include the appellant's pro forma, and we look at the 5-year average, let's say next year, the 2022 comes in, the INE is at the $13.88 that the pro forma is saying or stating, we would still smooth that out, and the average would be closer to the 3.524586. And that's what the county has provided for the expenses there. If you look at the total number in column F, and you include the pro forma with the last 4 years INEs, again, we would smooth it out just like we do all the other cases. When we receive that information, you've said it, you've heard it in the past where 1 year does not make the assessment. So when looking at the prior years and the most current, we would look at what is the stabilized expenses over the course of the 4 or 5 years. Now with that, we did arrive at an expense rate of $12, higher than what we've seen in the expense history of this property, with the exception of the 2018 INE. And so when we come down and arrive at a revised value, it is lower than what we had in the initial assessment. And I'd like to point out, when we arrived at our original 2022 assessment, we only had the 2019 INE. And at that point, they were showing a $3.4 million expense rate in 2019. And so we adjusted upwards of $12 a square foot in 2022. And now that we see that, operating year 2021 has been submitted, it's much lower than what we originally estimated to be the case for the original assessment. That's why when taking in consideration what the appellant is stating as far as expenses increasing, the average that we came up with in our column F should suffice and is enough to justify that $12 a square foot based on the history and based on the potential expense rate that they're proposing at $13.88. I think that's all I have. We're open for questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Questions from board members? Mr. Matzkin.
I have a question for the appellant. Given that so much of this building is GSA leased, does GSA pay pass-throughs like standard corporations, companies?
They do not. They do not. On certain items, they do. On other items, they handle directly. So for instance, GSA commonly will handle some operating expenses on their own. They'll, for instance, security or janitorial, I know, are two of the main ones that they typically directly contract with. So they won't pay pass-through on operating expenses related to those items. Other items they do. I believe real estate taxes, they'll pay pass-through, as is typical of other tenants. It just depends on the lease. Sometimes they have set rates for real estate tax pass-through that they'll pay.
So the department has a very low pass-through rate. I mean, just given how long some of these leases have been in effect, I guess that explains a lot of it. Seems like a very low number, but I'm not going to question
The other thing, Mr. Matzkin, is if operating expenses drop down below the base year, GSA actually gets a credit.
Sure.
So, it's they are low, but it is what it is, I guess.
Yeah, but remember, it's got to drop down. It could be 10 years into the lease, and it's gone up for 9 years and went back. It decreased in year 10 from year 9, but not from base year. But it's possible.
And the other thing to note is that in terms of real estate taxes, and you're probably already familiar with this, GSA only pays the base real estate tax and pass-throughs. They do not pay transportation tax or bid taxes. That is specifically excluded. Yeah, in fact, it is a subject of quite a bit of litigation.
Okay, thank you. A question for the department. The appellant stated that in very large vacancy situations, they said over 100,000 square feet, and that's this case, that you will provide 2-year lease up costs, but not but for some reason not in this case. You respond to that?
That is incorrect. It's over the excess of the vacancy guideline that we use. So if you turn to our page, I think it's 3 or 4, give me 1 second.
Is it in the guidelines? Can I look it up in the guidelines?
No, it's, so the way we treat excess vacancies on our page 5 of 121, you see the calculation there. So we have 141,764 that we see as vacant as the first of the year. That equates to 47%. We allocate or allow 25% vacancy deduction from that. And what's the residual of that is the 66,833. If the residual is higher than 100,000, then we add another layer.
After the guideline 25% vacancy rate.
Correct.
And Mr. Matskin, what our point on that was, is that the county does use a second year in buildings with over 100,000 square feet. We understand that. But the problem is each building does not exist in its own isolated market. And every building in the county competes with every other building. And so in terms of the vacancy rate, with negative absorption and over 9 million square feet available, 2 years should be used on all space. That's in excess of the allowable guideline vacancy rate.
That's your case. Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other questions from board members? No, Mr. Peralta, if you take a minute to wrap up, sir.
Yes, thank you. Let's see here. We did have, on the rent roll, we did see that there was a renewed lease, Suites 1050, I believe, released in 2020 at $38.48. That is what I see is the closest lease, the most current lease that we see on paper with this property. Again, CoStar is asking $39 a square feet minus the 6% is actually $36.66. The county is using $35 a square foot. We afforded some sort of leeway there as far as what they could receive in the near future. We do ask that the board take in consideration the revision. Again, we'd like to stress that, with the expenses at a higher rate as the pro forma suggests, we would smooth the expenses out over the 5 years and still come up with the same average, if you will, at $12 a square foot. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Harmon, if you take a minute to wrap up, sir.
Yes, thank you. So that's an interesting point on the operating expenses, using the 5-year average to smooth it. A couple of issues with that. Why would 2017 expenses factor into projected 2022 expense rates? We know that the costs have gone up in the past 5 years. Additionally, if that is the county's contention that we should use the 5-year average, why don't we use that for income also? The 5-year average income is only $9.1 million. You see the assessment is assessed 11.7 in income. There's inconsistent picking and choosing which methodology to use. On the income, we're projecting forward because that gets us to a higher assessment. On the operating expenses, we're looking back 5 years because that gets us a higher assessment. We need to be consistent on how we're looking at these. The stabilized column submitted by the appellant projects both income and operating expenses going forward from the data value. Additionally, buildings, such as we've discussed, the TSA buildings with over 100,000 square feet lease do get an additional year of lease up absorption. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, it's just among the board members. Where is everybody on this? Mr. Matskin.
Okay, I'll mumble something. Intuitively, I know this building, which isn't a surprise, and I expected, what I was doing was calculating, I thought my calculation was wrong. I have it as a 3.3% lowering from 2021, but in my eye, it's more like 5%, but I thought it might be lower than that. So I kept scrubbing the numbers over and over, And the income and the proposed, the potential income seems right to me, given that there's also a deduction for concessions, because questions, asking prices listed in CoStar or wherever, it's just an asking price. That doesn't mean they're going to get it for sure. But we don't know, but we do have some notion of the last couple of years what they are getting, the last couple of leases that came in. But I don't know if it should be, like, as I say lots of times, I don't know if it should be 34.26 a square foot or 35.07, but it's in the range certainly. And so I looked at operating expenses, and there's been a lot of discussion between the appellant and the department on that, but I see the operating expenses as much higher than the last 2 years. I want to go back to 2017 or 1986. I mean, the last 2 years, it's substantially higher than that. And so that makes sense to me. On the 2-year write-off for lease-up costs, intuitively, sure, the building's going to take more than 2 years to lease up, but as we've said many times, we don't predict the future. We go year by year, we don't double count. And next year, they'll get another, probably, if things hold true, they'll get another lease-up cost deduction. So even though I thought that it should be lower, I don't see how to lower it.
Okay. Other folks? Mr. Hoffman.
I kind of feel the same way as you can. I like the way you put it. It might be in for some trouble, but it's still pretty low at $240 a square foot with the Target and retail that's paying. So yeah, I mean, to me the question is, they're not going to sign 140,000 square feet of leases, in the next 6 months, which you would actually need to get the 2-year lease-up period. So it's more like, what do you have right now? What's your income? I don't know. I like the 2021 assessment better, but I just don't know how to get there. I don't think it's gotten much better since 21. That's 58 million we did last year.
All right, Mr. Penaranda or Yates?
Well, the feeling is there that the value should be lower because of the income itself. The only thing I did is I looked at the pro forma from the tenant and just worked out the expenses to $12 the county used, and I think that's more than enough in my opinion. And also did the below the line deductions to 1 year instead of 2. By doing that, I come up with an NOI of $5,182,269, and if I take the below the line deductions, but only taking 1 year for the lease out for the rent, the lot rent, the final value that I come up with 62,571,100.
62,571,000?
62,571,100.
All right, what's everybody think of that?
That's okay.
Mr. Hoffman
Yes.
or Mr. Yates?
Yes.
Okay. And Mr. Hoffman?
Yeah.
All right. Mr. Matskin?
One moment, please.
Okay.
Could you please repeat the RPC number, Madam Chair? Or the BOE case number?
193.
Okay.
It just says Fairfax Drive on there, but that's not the address.
Yeah.
Okay, thank God. All right, and the rationale for lowering it another 5 million or so is what?
Mr. Penaranda?
The rationale is based on pretty much the same feeling that we have. I think the income is just a little aggressive, so I'm taking the appellant's numbers, 32 for the vacant space.
And also concessions.
The concession is only for 1 year, not a 2-year for the loss rent.
Well, yeah, sure, they're for
And
one.
the expenses, I'm lowering it to 12 instead of what they're telling us.
You're taking the entire column G and adjusting for those two numbers.
Right.
I'm sorry, I thought I was wrong about being wrong here, but now I'm caught up.
Okay.
Understand.
Are you okay? Okay. All right. So Mr. Penron, if you'd like to make a motion and then clearly state how you got to the numbers for the minutes, please.
I'll move that we reduce the assessment to 62,571,100, and that's by using the pro forma numbers and reducing the expenses to $12 per square foot and taking only 1 year of loss rent.
Okay. I have a motion. Do I have a second? Mr. Hoffman. Okay. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Okay. It is 4-1 with no Ken. Mr. Matzkin. Okay. The assessment is reduced to 62,571,100 based on using column G, reducing the expenses to $12 and only taking 1 year below the line for the loss rent. Thank you. Okay, moving to the second case, RPC 1701315 at 2000 14th Street North. Mr. Harmon, you can start with your 8 minutes and tell us about this property, sir.
Yes, thank you. 2014th Street is a 117,000 square foot building. This is located 2 blocks off of Clarendon Boulevard. It's at 14th Street and Taft Street. This building is 35 years old. The building has been 34% vacant for each of the past 4 years. This coincides with the prior 4-year NOI, which has decreased for consecutive years from 2019 to 2020, and again from 2020 to 2021. 2021 NOI at the property was only $1.66 million. The assessment imputes an NOI of $2.2 million, or 30% higher than the best year of the past 4, when the NOI was only $1.7 million. The issues on appeal are the office rental rate for both leased and vacant space, the retail lease and vacant rental rate, the operating expenses, and the lease-up period. The leased office rental rate assumed by the assessment fails to account for the level of concessions that are required in the market as of the date of value. The most recent leasing activity for the property was for 14,000 square feet and required an average of 15% concessions. Applying this rate of concessions to existing leases, which with 2 exceptions all predate the pandemic and are not indicative of the current market, this results in an occupied office rental rate of $36.32 per square foot. Looking again at the most recent leasing activity at the property, we see that the net effective rental rate on this lease was $34. This is the rate the owners were able to lease space at the property for most recently, and as such, it's the best indication of the market for vacant space at the property. Additionally, the owners agreed to a lease renewal with post-op media at a severe discount to the prior rate this tenant was paying. Post-op media signed a 5-year renewal in June of 2020 at a base rental rate of $39 with 25% concessions. This results in a net effective rental rate of only $29.25 per square foot. This compares to the prior rent that post-op media was paying, which was $43.07. This lease, the prior lease, began at the end of 2013. The lease renewal, again at $29.25 per square foot, represents a 32% discount from the previous rental rate this tenant was paying. This renewal is indicative that the market rental rate has decreased significantly over the past couple of years and is nowhere near where it once was. Next, if you look at the county test column and the appellant's pro forma, you will notice that the test column imputes retail income while the pro forma does not. This is because the 12/31/2021 rent roll that was submitted with the I&E survey form did not report any retail tenants paying rent. What the county has done in the test column is to impute retail income. They recategorized a tenant from office to retail and imputed rent for a restaurant tenant that never opened and is currently in litigation. The county's rent roll on page 6 of the appeal shows the retail tenant as Bright Horizons, occupying 13,000 square feet, which spans both the first and second floors of the building. The owner reported this space as office space, while the county decided to move them to retail. We've classified this space as office to be consistent with how they were reported on the rent roll, and as such, the income is included in the occupied office. That's why you see no retail income on the appellant's pro forma. It's because the owner classified it as office, and that's how we included it as well. The county moved it to retail. The assessment also imputes rent on space that is leased to a restaurant that never opened and has not paid rent. This space is still leased, and the owner is currently in litigation with the tenant. As such, the 2,400 square feet attributable to the restaurant should be imputed at $0 to reflect the fact that it is leased but with no income. The assessment also understates the amount of expenses required to operate a stabilized property. As I stated at the beginning of the case, this property has been at least 34% vacant and as high as 42% vacant over the past 4 years. Despite excess vacancy and record inflation in 2021, the assessment imputes operating expenses at the same rate as were actually incurred in year 2020. Here again, it's simply illogical to assume that imputing income as if tenancy is at 75% occupied will not result in an increase in operating expenses. If we are hypothetically increasing occupancy, which is what we do when we impute income on vacant space, then we must also account for the expenses those hypothetical new tenants who are hypothetically paying rent will consume. Increasing operating expenses by the variable cost per occupied square foot that was reported in 2021 easily exceeds what the county has imputed. Finally, here again, by only imputing 1 year for lease-up, the assessment ignores both the history of the property and the office market as it existed on the date of value. As I discussed on the previous case, the county does apply a 2-year lease-up period on certain properties in the county, and it should do so for this property as well. A 2-year lease-up period is supported by the fact that over 9 million square feet of office space was vacant in the county as of the first of the year, and that absorption in the county has been negative each of the past 2 years. If the space is still vacant as of the first of 2023, then it likely will need to be reevaluated, and if the market is in the same state as it was 1 year prior, a 2-year lease-up period is probably applicable in that situation as well. This is not double counting the discount. This is how a market participant, as of the date of value, would value the property. They would look at what's available in the county, what's been the absorption over the past couple of years in the county, and then make a determination based on that. As such, 2 years is more appropriate for lost rent than 1 year. So to reiterate, the NOI at the property has decreased from 2019 to 2020, and again from 2020 to 2021, yet the assessment imputes an NOI that is $500,000 higher than what was reported in 2021. The assessment values the property in excess of fair market value by overstating the rental income that can be achieved at the property, understating both the operating expenses and the lease-up costs that are anticipated at the property. Thank you. And Eileen, do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Peralta for the county, please.
Yes, thank you. For this case, the 2021 INE does not report the income for the vacant space. So if you want to refer to the NOI of the prior years as well, they don't report the way they should and the way the county is asking them to report as a gross potential income. So when we arrive at our original 4.5 million for the original assessment and similar in our test, it is because we're imputing the income that they don't report for the vacant space. And I think we've stressed this in prior cases as well as the prior years. When we look at this case, the rental income that's received, the new office lease for $37.25 on average. We have the two 2021 leases that we see in the rent roll at $37 per square foot and $37.50 per square foot. Those are the 2021 leases that we have in place that we did see. Bright Horizon is a daycare. I view it as a retail. Yes, it does have a second floor space, but it is all retail in my assumption. We treat it as such. The difference between treating it retail and treating it the way the appellants have in the pro forma is 66 cents in the difference in rate. So if you want to put it back in office, the county's okay with that, but it's 66 cents per square foot, the difference in rate that is applied if you put it back in the office portion of the pro forma that the appellant's using. With respect to expenses, maybe I wasn't clear in the last case, but the 5-year projected is looking forward. If the appellant's pro forma or their estimate at $11.30 is the proposed or the expected expense rate to be received or to be spent in 2022, if we look at the 5-year, 2018, 19, 20, 21, and the expected $11.30 in 2022, the county would still stabilize that and look at what they've done in the past and historically, and you still would come up to an expense rate of $1,261,173. That's including 2018 to 2022. And that was my point in the last case, and that is similar to my point in this case. With respect to expenses, not expenses, a 2-year lease up. Again, we've done this with every case, with every office building that has excess of 100K, 100,000 over the guideline vacancy that is, in this case, 25%. We would provide an additional discount for that square footage above 100,000 square feet. I don't have anything else to add, but I'm open for questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Questions from board members? Mr. Yates.
For the county, would you respond a little more toward their statements that there is actually no income retail?
Well, it doesn't mean that another building, if you will, if you were to treat it as vacant, you would still propose an income for that property, for that square foot.
As vacant.
As vacant. Because it's in this, I guess, litigation, if you will, that doesn't mean that they wouldn't receive any income from that space. They're under contract, and the lease that I see is till 2029. And who knows, they can defer that rent for the following year, or I'm not sure. They might abate.
It's dollars per square foot on
The dollar per square foot for that. They didn't indicate $1 per square foot. That would be a question for the appellant to ask. They didn't indicate a square foot, but they're under a lease, so there's actually a contract rent that's involved there.
I collect on it, but it's like
If there's been zero rent paid, zero rent collected, we don't know if we'll ever get rent. We don't know if we'll be able to lease that space at this point.
yeah.
Okay, Mr. Metzgen.
Thank you. For the department, look at, I have 2 questions, but they're really the same question. On columns F and G on row 1, the square footage is different when you're assuming the vacant office, the value, gross potential income vacant office. You're basing it on 2 different sizes of square footage.
They're adding the retail to the office.
That's theirs. That's how it goes up to, that's that 13,000. Okay, great. Now, maybe now go down columns D and F, below the line. Question, different allowed square footages, 32,000 versus 13,000.
Yeah, initially in the 2022 assessment, we saw that there was a greater amount of square feet vacant at 61,060 square feet versus what is actually vacant.
Based on column E.
42.
I was hoping you'd say that. Okay, last question for the department. On page 2 of 102, the appellant makes a case that they're going to have to demolish everything and start all over again. And you don't know, maybe sometimes, you know, you get a perfect fit or you don't, or who knows what. And it also will reflect on the rate. Generally, the more tenant improvement allowance the landlord provides, the higher is going to be the income from that space, and vice versa, low TI, low rent. So my question is, says will need to be, let me see if I can read my question. If that happens, they just demolish in this year, you know, 2022, will the operating expenses, do you consider that a legitimate operating expense in 2023 when determining what the operating expense ought to be over time? If they really are spending big bucks to demolish and rebuild, is that a legitimate operating expense? I guess that's a simple way to put it.
Does it improve the quality of the building? Would be my question. And would it extend the life of the building so that would be treated more as a capital improvement?
That's exactly my question. I mean, you're redoing a suite, a space, a leasable space. Sometimes you build a wall or take a wall down and it costs $1.50. Sometimes you got to deconstruct it. So is the department's position when you're really deconstructing, that's a capital improvement and not just turnover, cost of turnover?
I haven't seen that
Hard to know.
included as expenses to my knowledge, but we would treat it more as a capital.
Is that okay? That's okay. Question asked and answered. Thank you.
Okay, other questions? No? Okay, Mr. Peralta, if you take a minute to wrap up, sir.
I think it's okay.
Yes, thank you. Again, on the original assessment, we're allotting for more square footage vacant. Our test did conclude that there was a higher value to be determined based on the most recent information. We are asking the board to only confirm the original assessment at $26,601,800. And that's, again, with the similar, I guess, rents that we used in the test, slightly lower in the retail compared to the original assessment. If you look at the test column, there is management space being rented out at $31.74. The pro forma actually agrees with what that number is. And again, if we look at the expenses, if we smooth it over 5 years, including the proposed 2022 number, we're still at $11 a square foot. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Harmon, if you take a minute to wrap up, sir.
Yes, thank you. First, I'd like to address the historical expenses. The historical expenses reported at this property that the county relies on for the 2022 assessment. Keep in mind, this property has been 42%, 36%, 38%, and 34% vacant over these past 4 years. This is not stabilized occupancy. The assessment stabilizes occupancy at only 25% vacant. We have to account for the 9% difference in occupancy that we've done in income, but we haven't done in operating expenses. So for this reason, operating expenses in 2022, since we did gross up income to account for the additional leased space, hypothetically, we need to do the same for operating expenses. Next, there was a lease renewal of a captive tenant at $29.25 per square foot. 4 leases were effective from 2020 to 2022, including this lease renewal, and these 4 leases had a weighted average rental rate of only $33.88. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, it's just among the board members. Mr. Hoffman.
I mean, I can't argue with any of the numbers in column G that the appellants put forth. The only thing I would change is the 2-year rent loss, go back to 1 year, just kind of for consistency.
Mhm.
But, I mean, if you were to ask me today, what I would pay for this building, it's under $200 a square foot. Now, that doesn't mean somebody else wouldn't. And again, that's today versus January 1st. But this building's in trouble. There's not a capital market out there that's going to pay $26,601,000 for this building as is. So I think it needs to be reduced. And I came up with $23,607,200.
Based on using column G.
Column G, and then changing the first below the line deduction to $953,734.
And I'm sorry, why did you change the first deduction to 900? Wouldn't it be 459, 200?
No, the $34 a square foot times 28,051 is 953,734.
Right, but I thought on the test that they, after they account for the 25% above the line, that leaves 13,000.
Oh, I was just going with the column G number here, which is 28,051.
Yeah, I don't think that's correct, but I don't know what other people think.
The parking areas.
So it would be the 459.
Right. Well, that's at $35, but I mean.
All right.
Mr. Metzgen.
I'm following along. I have one question on a tweak, and that is the childcare space. I don't agree that it ought to be, well, two things. I don't think it should be office space. I think it should be potential gross income as a little bit more expensive per square foot retail space. I mean, you couldn't have childcare in a space that is zoned as office. I mean, they just wouldn't allow it. There's no question. And so I would take that 13,000, and somebody'd have to give me the exact figure, and take it out as vacant office at $34 and put it in as vacant retail at $36. What do you think of that?
Well, they haven't taken occupancy of it. They're in litigation over it. They're not probably taking out, it may be going back to office.
It's a different space.
No, it's,
Oh,
I'm talking about the first and second floor retail. I mean, it's leased as office.
okay, okay, I'm sorry.
That's quite right. I mean, this is a lot of information coming very fast.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yeah, I fixed it, the below the line deductions from column F, and it came to 25, 295, 200.
Now
Okay,
we're
what's
getting very close to D. I could live with
So what does the rest of the folks think about that? Mr. Penaranda?
I don't feel as strong as the previous case. I think, based on the numbers, we're really talking minor differences. So I'm okay with the original assessment.
What about the expenses?
I think it's okay.
that. Yeah, I do
To
too.
legal.
Yeah, 30 cents one way or the other. It's not
Yeah.
it's just-
Right, I just look at the historical NOI, and I think Greg's got a good argument there for the standpoint that the NOI in the original and the test still seems very high to me.
Based on the discussions, there's a lot of little tweaks.
Yeah.
And the question is just which do you?
Okay, so I guess, Mark, you're a deciding vote. Where do you?
The thing is, there are numbers, I think, that the appellant doesn't really include. So the NOI is kind of misleading. don't think it's really like in other cases that we see, oh yeah, that's the NOI that we see, and that's the history, and it's really way off.
Yeah, it's not way off. Do you think the 25 million is, do you feel that that's a right number?
I think so. It's still a reduction from the previous assessments. Yeah, 6.5%.
All right, so we're split on the just accepting the current one.
It seems there's some tweaks up and down.
Yeah,
More, you know,
I think I'd have to go with the original assessment then.
With what?
The original assessment.
All right, and you're with that as well, Mr. Metzgen?
Yeah, because it's 6% decrease. I mean, it should be decreased, there's no question, from last year. And that's what we're seeing typically in Metro
Okay,
accessible.
no, I understand.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure where you are. So Greg, I don't feel we've got enough votes for the motion, so
It'll come down. Yeah, it'll come down again.
Yeah.
At that.
somebody who's in agreement with it, could you make a motion, please?
I'll go ahead and move that we confirm the assessment at 26,601,800.
I second.
Okay, motion and second by Mr. Metzgen. All in favor
That's,
and opposed? Okay, it's 3-2, and that's without myself and Mr. Hoffman, but the county is confirmed at 26,601,800. Thank you. Moving along to the third case on the agenda, RPC 3402426 at 1225 South Clark. Mr. Harmon, you can start with your 8 minutes on this property, sir.
Yes, thank you. 1225 South Clark Street. This is a 277,000 square foot building in Crystal City. It was built in 1982. The issue on appeal is the operating expenses. First, if you'd be so kind as to direct your attention to the DREA summary on page 4 of the appeal, I'd like to point out that the DREA test column imputes the actual 2021 parking income, the actual 2021 pass-through income, the actual 2021 other income, and the actual 2021 miscellaneous income. This is the typical manner in which this income is handled on assessments in the county. The prior year actual reported figures are used. This has come up in several other cases this year, and this is a prime example of how the county typically handles these income streams. So next, the assessment imputes $9 per square foot for operating expenses. This is below what the property can expect to incur at a stabilized, fully utilized property. The assessed rate of $9 is exactly the same as the rate assessed in 2021, despite the market experiencing 7% inflation over the course of 2021. Additionally, office properties in this area were only physically occupied by 36% of tenants as of the end of the year due to work from home policies. We have provided evidence of this in the board book. As employees return to the office, operating expenses will increase due to the increased use of, just to name a few, utilities, janitorial services, trash collection. Since the assessment has failed to factor in the effects of inflation and increased physical occupancy expected to affect the property, the taxpayer respectfully requests the operating expense rate be increased as set forth in the appeal. Thank you. And Eileen, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I do. I just want to address the issue of operating expenses and little tweaks. You know, the owners of the properties are submitting income and expense survey forms that they certify to. And the income, the NOI, is the bottom line of the property. And, you know, what we're seeing right now is the county is looking backwards and looking at operating expenses from that time period, but they're not looking backwards and looking at income, gross potential income or net operating income from that period. I can tweak numbers, you can tweak numbers, the county can tweak numbers, but the truth is that NOI is the most indicative of the property's performance. And I don't think that anybody can argue with that. And the fact that these forms are certified to is, I think, very important for the board to consider. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Peralta, please.
Yes, thank you. This case is a good example of what we, are saying and what we've stated. The gross potential for this property, if you look at 2018 to 2020, because this property was vacant, they didn't report that vacant income. So the gross potential that they stated in 18 is 5.6, 19, 5.9, 2020, 6.6. And then when they leased up from last year to this year, they're at 10.1. So this is a good example of how not to, or to understand that they're not reporting correctly in prior years. It's when they actually are leased up, and you can see the true potential of this property at 10.153 for the 2021 assessment. Our test and our original assessment isn't too far off. When you look at the NOI that the appellants are stating, we must take a look at and must look at the true potential of this property. They've been reporting 2.3, 3.5, 2.5, and most recent 2.9, and yet the appellant is proposing that they'll make 6.3. And that's, considerably more than what they're reporting in the NOIs. Again, this is stating exactly what we've been saying. They're not reporting it as correctly as the department is asking. With the exception in 2021, they did report the actual income they received, but they also provided the concessions of nearly half of what the income is generating, 4.779104. So, I mean, when you look at our test is actually even lower than the original assessment. And what has changed from last year to this year? Our assessment decreased about 0.15%, but they increased their occupancy by 113,958 square feet. Pure logic would state that this property is worth more. It's leased up now more than the prior 3 years. But yet we, in our test, are decreasing it even further at 91,597,100. And that's with the most current information. That's what the rents that we've seen included. And you see, if you compare column F to column G, our numbers aren't too far off from what the appellant is stating. They're proposing a $9.50 expense rate, but that's not what they've shown in the actual year that they leased up. $8.51, and we're still at, even higher at $9 a square foot. I would just ask the board to take that in consideration, really look at the numbers and compare it year to year, and really see how reporting correctly does affect the perception of what this building can achieve. Thank you.
Okay, questions from board members? Mr. Matzkin.
I have a question for the department. Columns E and F. To me, the big difference between the bottom lines on F and G are rows 8 and 10, vacancy and concessions. The concessions in row E are very, very high, and as you said, almost 50% of gross potential of office income. Excuse me. So the very first question, though, is in column F. Where did you get this 900,000 plus figure for vacancy?
That's just applying 10% to the net leasable area.
That's the guideline, 10%. And okay, then I'll ask the appellant, where does the 4.8 million come from? Just below that in column E.
The 4.8 million is what was reported on the 2021 income and expense survey form, and there is a copy of that included on the appeal. That begins on page 48 of 88, and you see where specifically that's reported. So that's on page 50 of 88 of the PDF. It is row I-11, rent concessions, they've reported 4.779 million at that section of the INE.
I mean, that's, and those kids, are those concessions also for existing tenants as well as new in 2021?
Those are the concessions that were incurred in 2021. So that could be.
Your question is, the answer to your question is yes.
I didn't understand that. Say again.
You asked the question if it was for existing tenants. The answer is yes.
It's for all the above because COVID and people weren't showing up and had to give breaks in existing leases as well as attracting new tenants.
And also, we're also seeing a lot of leases, and I'm sure you are as well, where abatements or free rent is not necessarily all front loaded. So a tenant that may get 12 months free rent may have the first 6 months front loaded and then receive 1 month free per lease year thereafter. I know we were just involved in a lease like that. So I don't think that you can necessarily, I think that that is hopefully an explanation that answers your question.
Okay.
Cloudy to you, just to me. Okay.
Okay, other questions from board members? No? Mr. Peralta, if you take a minute to wrap up, sir.
I don't really have too much to add. Again, we're similar in our expense rate. I mean, our rates as far as the leases in place, potential rent for the vacant office. That concession is primarily for in 2021 was primarily for the PBS lease, and that's the 12 months front loaded. I believe I heard Ms. Bowman correctly. So when you look at the potential for this property, I think we're in line with the 91,597,100, taking into consideration that this property did lease up again over 113,098 square feet from last year to this year, and we're decreasing it even more, just based on how we value the properties.
Okay. All right, thank you. Mr. Harmon, if you take a minute to wrap up, sir.
Yes, thank you. Just to reiterate on the operating expenses, the imputed operating expenses on the assessment are the exact same as 2021. That does not account for increased physical occupancy. Again, at the end of 2021, only about 1/3 of employees were actually going into the office. As more employees go into the office, expenses will go higher. The assessment does not make any adjustments for income relating to decreased physical occupancy. So it should not make a decrease to operating expenses due to a decrease in physical occupancy. If we look at the historical reported operating expenses and project to physically occupied building, we do get to a higher rate at $9.50 per square foot for operating expenses. Thank you.
Okay, it's just among the board members. Where is everybody on this? Mr. Hoffman.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate kind of condensing this into the single argument that's strongest to the case, and definitely understand operating expenses aren't, you can't just trend them up 2% a year anymore. It's just not the world we live in. It's been like that way for a while, and it's changed. So I didn't think we'd go as far as 950 this year, but at 925, I've got a small reduction to the NOI, and I ended up at 90,635,300.
Okay, Mr. Matzkin.
Yeah, I heard the appellant, of course, talk about operating expenses just now in the wrap up. And I'm looking at 2020 is 828, 2021 is 851. And the department pegged it at 9 for this year. That's the trend that, Greg, you're talking about, that is appropriate and realistic. So I don't follow.
Well, 6% on the prior year is about 2.5 million. So 925 is between 6 and 7% from the 20.
So just you're straight lining out 6%.
Yeah,
every year.
it's CPI is above that.
Well, what's $9 over 850? Should know that it's 1/2, it's 4.5%.
Yeah.
It's close.
Right, but I guess I look, in response to that, I look at the actual dollar amount.
I'm doing the same. Yeah.
If you look at 18, I mean, I'm fine with where, in 2020, at 2.3, now you're up to, right under 2.5. I mean,
Well, again, what about then the concessions and the
I'm
concessions?
not talking about concessions. I'm talking about just the expenses.
No, I know that. I
Okay.
thought your case was
Okay.
finished. It's going on.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, because we're hearing, yeah, I get it in this room that you probably couldn't hear.
No.
But, okay, so we have one huge concession for a quality, one hopes successful tenant. And of course, you can't, nor does the appellant suggest that it ought to be carried forward dollar for dollar. I mean, nobody suggests that, but shouldn't it be an influence given as of 1/1/22, the world we live in, concessions are real. A part of the game with Arlington's probably highest office vacancy rate ever, certainly in modern times.
Concessions is all these cases and a big impact.
Yeah, but here's zero. That's my point. Or do you think the vacancy, the almost $1 million, accounts for that?
Every case we've looked at has got they're looking at concessions, we're looking at vacancy only.
You want to just keep it that way? That's what
I don't
I'm
know what
asking.
else
I'm not
to do.
telling.
I mean, unless the county starts to look at concessions differently, it's.
Okay,
Yeah.
the question asked and answered. Well, maybe.
I disagree with the way they look at it, but that's the way every case is. And
Equalization.
that's a big item on every case.
Mhm.
In this case, though, it's extraordinary. But again, they now understand why it's so large, and you can't carry it through. So, so that's fine.
I thought that when you use the stabilized guideline numbers, that is what it is, vacancy and concessions, when they do the guidelines.
My personal feelings, I think they suppress that a little bit. But
Especially these days.
And it's, given it right now, but that's the way they all are.
In this case, we're looking at, you look at the pro forma column and the revised, they're pretty much, the only difference is the expenses on the bottom. And I think, first, like Mary said, I think just, don't justify it.
Yeah, the bottom, the actual numbers, not the percentages.
Oh, sure.
You see that.
I always go for actual.
How do you feel about the flow of the number increasing annually?
I mean, I think it should be higher because there's another 100,000 on expenses, another 100,000 feet of occupancy that wasn't there over the last 3 years. And that's a huge deal, right?
On the other hand, how could it be assessed less? The department's saying it should be assessed less for a much more tenanted building.
Well, just because it was too high in prior years. It's like, look at it today, it's at $330 a square foot. I mean, this is not a great office market. Capital markets can change things too. You could sign a bunch of leases, but then all of a sudden you're underwater because interest rates are 7%.
I mean, you're still looking at almost $190,000 above the previous year.
Say that again. Looking at
The expenses that the county is using,
expenses.
it's almost $200,000 more than the 2020.
2021 was $2,363,000.
So you're 120, 25.
Yeah.
25,000 more.
I mean, if you told me bring this tenant in and at 100,000 feet, you're only going to spend $1 a square foot for their electrical, their janitorial, their dumpster pulls, I'd say I'm not going to do that deal. Like that's light. So.
I think the county already considered it because when they used those numbers, they didn't have 2021, so they had already increased it to.
Mm-hmm.
I hear what you're saying.
I mean, I'm okay with 925, but it doesn't sound like I have a consensus here. So.
Yeah, I don't think you do.
Yeah. Let's move on.
All right. Well, that being said, then I'm going to move to accept the county's revised number of 91,597,100. Do I have a second? I'm sorry? Okay, Mr. Metzger, the second. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Okay, so it is 4-1 without Mr. Hoffman.
And I abstain.
You're not in this vote to start with anyway, so,
Easy to abstain.
but thank you. And I'll go back to, so it's reduced to the county's revised number of 91,597,100. Okay, that being said, Mr. Lawson is joining us now for case 4. So case 4, RPC is 16039-036 at 1621 North Kent. Mr. Herman, you can start with your 8 minutes on this property, sir.
Yes, thank you. 1621 North Kent is Roslyn Plaza, Building E. This has 153,000 square feet of net leasable area, and the building is 56 years old. Roslyn Plaza is at the end of Roslyn, just before the GW Parkway. This complex is outdated and very drab. The surface grade at the area is awkward, with the main level being slightly above some of the surrounding streets. The plaza also receives limited sunlight and feels a mile away from the heart of Roslyn. At this property, it's important to note that NOI has decreased over the past 3 years and was only $720,000 in 2021. Vacancy at the property has been over 50% for each of the past 3 years and was 65% vacant as of the date of value. So NOI has decreased and vacancy has increased over the past 3 years. This building, we're all familiar with the Roslyn Plaza complex. This building is in a state of flux. It is neither operating as a stabilized office building, but it is also a part of a redevelopment site plan. It seems a state of flux has caused issues for how to assess the property. If you direct your attention to the DREA summary sheet on page 4 of the appeal, you'll see that comment 2 at the bottom of the page mentions the site plan this property is a part of. This comment states that the land value, based on the site plan, is $18,877,200, and the assessment should be allocated in that way. This appears to value the property for its development potential. If this is what the county believes the property's highest and best use is as a development site, then it should be valued at the land value plus the excess income expected from the improvement added below the line. In this case, that would be the county's stated land value of $18.9 million plus the 2021 NOI of $720,000 for a total of $19.62 million. Instead, what the assessment has done is valued the property for both its development potential and its income potential. This is contrary to the principle of inconsistent use. The principle of inconsistent use holds that the land and its improvements must be valued on the same basis. Land cannot be valued on the basis of one use, while the improvements are valued on the basis of another. We either need to assess the property as a development site with the land value plus excess income attributable to the improvements, or we need to assess the land and improvements as an income-producing office building, but not both. If we're going to value the property as an income-producing property, we need to look at the stabilized potential and not chase a value based on the development potential of the land. Looking at the DREA test on the summary page, we see that the assessment overstates the rental potential of the vacant office space, overstates both pass-through and parking income, understates expenses, and understates the cost required to lease up the property to stabilized occupancy. The county imputes vacant office rent based on a short-term 3-year renewal at the property that is not indicative of market leases. According to the owner, a face rental rate of $31 per square foot is what the market for the property is. This amounts to just over $29 per square foot after 6% concessions are factored in. Next, the assessment imputes pass-through and parking income at the 4-year average rate. This is contrary to how other similarly situated properties in the county are assessed, where the prior year actual figures are used. We saw this just on the prior case. This is especially an issue for the parking income imputed by the assessment at this property. You can see over the past 4 years that the vacancy rate at the building has gone from 48% in 2018 to 65% in 2021. Clearly, fewer employees are going to be parking at the office when 17% less space is occupied. Yet by including the 2018 and 2019 parking income figures in the average, the assessment bumps up what should otherwise be expected. 2021 parking income was only $48,000. The assessment imputes $192,000. There is no reason to believe that the property, having less space leased as of January 1, 2022, than at any point over the prior 4 years, will achieve parking income that is 4 times greater than what was achieved in 2021. This is especially the case once we consider the stickiness of work from home policies. By including 2018 and 2019 parking income in the assessed value, the assessment vastly overstates what the property can hope to achieve in parking income. The pass-through income imputed by the assessment is also significantly greater than what was actually reported in 2021 and not likely to be achieved in 2022. Finally, the assessed operating expenses at $9.50 per square foot are not reflective of what the property will require to operate at stabilized occupancy. Again, this property has been over 50% vacant for the past 3 years. The past 2 years have seen operating expenses reported be significantly affected by reduced use by employees due to the pandemic. If we look back to the last year when the building was not affected from work from home policies necessitated by the pandemic, we see that operating expenses in 2019 were $9.79 per square foot. The 2020 assessment reflected this 2019 rate by imputing operating expenses at $10 per square foot. Yet in 2021 and 2022, the assessments, even though both impute income as if the building is occupied, decreased the operating expenses to $9.50 per square foot. If we go back to those 2019 operating expenses, again, when the building was 50% vacant, by a nominal rate of, if we increase them by a nominal rate of inflation to reach anticipated January 1st, 2022 operating expense rates, we get to $11 per square foot. This doesn't even account for the additional 25% occupancy that is required to reach stabilization, at which point operating expenses would be even higher. So to summarize, the NOI at this property has decreased significantly over the past 4 years, while vacancy has significantly increased. The assessment imputes an NOI that is over $1 million higher than any NOI achieved in the past 4 years. What the assessment has done is attempted to chase the value of the land as a development site, while also valuing the property as an income-producing building. As such, it goes against the principle of inconsistent use. We either need to value the site as a development site with a below-the-line addition for excess income attributable to the improvement, or we need to value the property as an income-producing property and use a stabilized potential based on what the property can realistically hope to achieve as of the first of the year. As such, the taxpayer respectfully requests the assessment be reduced as set forth in the appeal. Thank you. And Eileen, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I do. I would just like to ask the board if it has questions about the development potential, the lease structure, etc. Please ask us about them, because I just want to make sure that that is not something that comes up in discussion that where you don't have an opportunity to find out the answers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Peralta for the county, please.
Sure. I didn't hear which form we stated, but
Can we?
okay. Sorry. All right. For this case, we are valuing this property as income producing. I think that was for the case prior year. There was just an allocation towards the land, which the value of that property was valued as income producing. So when we're looking at this case, we do see that there was a lease that signed, the most recent lease, and it did lease for, I believe, 30. Let's see, sorry. $34.50 per square foot. It's a 2021 lease. It's indicative of what the market, what this property can achieve. There are no other leases that are in place that go beyond 2024. This lease actually goes to 2026. Not sure exactly why, but if they are scheduled for redevelopment, that would explain why this property is increasing in vacant square footage. I'm only speculating. I'm not too sure exactly what the plans are for this property. But when you look at the main differences between the revision and the appellant's pro forma, that's the main difference, is the vacant square footage for this property. We do have the lease that we cite, and that's what we use for the vacant office per square foot rate. We do take that down for the excess vacancy below the line. We do allocate a different number than the appellant. I'm not sure where their number is coming from, but we have a total of 98,161 square feet that we have vacant. They have 98,199. Our page 5 includes exactly how we derived our allowed 60,382 square feet. Excess vacancy below the line, we're at $90 a square feet versus their $100 a square feet. Again, I'd like to cite, like in prior cases, the highest we've seen in the reports and resources that we see is $70 a square foot. I can go over the concessions that we go through every year with every INE that we receive, and stating, they have the information that is available, and it states exactly how much concessions were given for this particular lease. We take all that in consideration. If they don't report the concessions, we can't make up a number to say this is what it should have been, but this is what we actually receive in the county, and this is what we go over in the last few years, actually, because it's become an issue on these cases, and concessions is of concern. I've taken it upon myself to really look at these concessions, and if they report it correctly, then I can use it. So if the reports are saying at best $70 a square foot, and our reports are saying similar, then we would adjust accordingly. But unfortunately, the information is not there to suggest anymore. We do, in this case, afford more than the $70 a square foot TIs that we originally gave in the assessment. We actually underassessed the office potential on the original assessment. We were at $32 versus the appellant saying that they can achieve $33.78. For the retail, we're at $31.50. The appellant saying that the potential for the property is $34.78, which we agree. But other than that, those are the main differences that we see, and we're open for questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Questions from board members? Mr. Hoffman.
Yeah, it looks like the new lease, was that a retail tenant?
No, I think that's an office tenant. Coalition Inc.
Okay.
It was a lease renewal, Mr. Huffman.
Which, I mean, I'll ask the appellant, landlord termination option in there, some kind of termination option for redevelopment?
I can address that. There are termination options in many of the leases, and they run between 9 and 12 months notice to the tenant. So that is one of the reasons why we believe that it should either be valued as a development site, which gets you to that $18,777,000 value, or based on the income approach using a realistic income. I think last year the board said the income approach was too high, but felt like there was some value to the development potential of the site. Mr. Harmon has tried to address that by saying, yeah, let's look at the development potential to 18,777,000 dollars, and add the actual income achieved.
Yeah, I didn't see the worksheet for that, how that 18,877 in the package. Is it, did I miss it? Is it on there somewhere?
It's not. in there.
It's basically, I don't know if it's in there or not. I mean, that's the number Rob has in there.
Okay.
But that is the number that is the assessment for the land, and as you know, the way the county values land and improvements is what they do is they come up with a land value based upon the existing density, especially in this sort of case, and then they come up with the total value and subtract it out the improvement value from the capitalized value. So I think you can tie backwards into that number.
We just have the number, so I don't know, could you explain kind of what's approved on the site plan right now?
I could show it to you. It's one of the most complicated. Jordan, can you pull up that worksheet from the county? It's a very complicated site plan that involves most of Roslyn Plaza, including London and Normandy House, etc.
Okay.
So what the county does is it takes the total density approved based on FAR for office, based on hotel, multifamily, etc. And then they take the square feet of land and divide the total area by the square feet of land to come up with the land value, because it's density that can be moved around on the site.
Mm-hmm.
So they do it on a per square foot of land basis, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I feel like it's over almost $400 or more than $400 per square foot.
Wow.
$435.72 per square foot.
Per square foot
of dirt.
Oh, yeah, I don't care about the square foot of dirt. How much density are they putting on that site?
I understand, but Mr. Hoffman, that's how they value it. So what they do is they took the total density for the entire site, came up with a number, and then because that density can go to different places on the site, they valued it on. They took the total square feet and divided the value of the density over the entire site.
So we've got, the next case is the London House and the Normandy House. So what's the total density on the 3 sites that we're going to be looking at today? That's approved.
Lori, are you on?
Well, the total density that's on the site that's approved is what exists. The other density is subject to a 4.1
I think Lori
and will require 4.1 approval.
Oh, okay, I thought Jordan said that there was a site plan approved. I heard it wrong. I'm sorry. Hold on, Barnes might have some clarification.
Is it phase development site plan?
It is.
Okay.
There's a PDF.
Greg, it's not allocated per site. It's just overall, this area has this density. And then you allocate it however.
So the county, again, has done it on a per square foot basis. They've taken, this site could end up being an open park.
Exactly.
It could end up being an office. It could end up being a hotel. So the total density value for the way the county does it using their uniform guidelines came up with a value of, say, $100 million. And if there was 100 million square feet of dirt, each square foot would be valued at $1. So,
do we know what that number is for the 3 properties?
But it's not based on the 3. You mean the total assessment for each property, or the?
I'm asking the county because it sounded like we looked at this last year. Yeah. And we had the worksheets and the site plan and had that information, and now we don't.
No, I don't.
Yeah, we didn't.
It was
I
an
went back and.
allocation. So the 2021 assessment was originally for the land only was 21,080,400. When the board reduced it, they dropped it to the 18,877,200.
Okay.
Which we're using in this case. It's just an allocation of the total assessed value based on the income.
That 18 million is for this one RPC. So there's really 5 of them, 2 apartment buildings and 3 office buildings.
And there's many more than 5 RPCs, Mr. Maskin.
Oh, they're subdivided. So, but this site plan is one economic unit, banding them all together,
The
right?
site plan is one phase, one PDSP, or the PDSP covers a large number of parcels. this parcel is a part of that site plan.
Yeah.
And our point is either value it as land based on the site plan, which is that $18 million figure, or value it using the income approach, but not both. And just going back to the income approach, the owner said that they anticipated, the rent that we used being the rent that they would be able to achieve. In fact, they had a tenant that cut their space in half and kept only the view side of the building, and their face rent was $31 a square foot with 6 months free rent. So the actual rent on the property is less than $30 a square foot. But to Mr. Hoffman's point, there is a termination clause in it. Now, the owners have no plans of terminating. They see no potential for development at this site in the immediate future, but they have kept their options open. And in terms of occupancy, the Plaza North is going to continue to be operated, and they still suffer from vacancy. I think that the address is 1777, and that building has still has vacancy at it.
In their case, I'm not sure if she's answering the
I
question.
mean, this is important, it's pretty relevant. We're gonna be dealing with this case, and some other ones related to this site plan, so I just wanna understand it. What's that? It's not approved?
It's not approved.
Not approved. We're all in agreement that there's no approved site plan, but there's a kind of a, what'd you call it, Mark Barnes, a phased development plan?
Yeah, Greg, what it is you have a phased development site plan, and unless and until you get a 4.1 site plan, you don't have any idea what density your site's going to end up with. Like Eileen said, it could end up being a park. Pentagon City, the entirety of Pentagon City is a phased development site plan, and as each parcel develops, the county has a density. And if you go in, when we did Pentagon Row, we converted residential into retail, and there's a formula for that. And so I don't think you can base it right now on a site plan. I think you got to go with the building, what it is now, and the income.
Okay.
Right, okay, I think that part is in for discussion, but
Yeah.
rather than questions, but I think we're in agreement that there's not an approved site plan on it at this point. So we can't have our cake and eat it too. So we're going back to that. Final questions from board members. Nope, Mr. Peralta, then take a minute and wrap up, please.
Yes, thank you. I did find that phase development site plan, if you guys want to see it at a later point. But with respect to the income approach for this property, I think we're in agreement with the rates used. The only difference, the main difference, is that lease that they signed till 2029. We used that as the potential for the vacant office. And, I think that's the main difference there. So with that, the rest of it.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Harmon, if you take a minute to wrap up, sir.
Yes, thank you. Just to reiterate, looking at the 4-year operating history of this property, NOI has not gone above $1.6 million in any of those 4 years. The high water mark was 2018 when NOI was $1.55 million. The 4-year average NOI is $1.22 million. The assessment is at $2.5 million. This is double the 4-year operating history reported at the property. This is due to over-reporting the office income potential on vacant space. It overstates the pass-through parking and other income at the property by including 2018 and 2019 figures when people were still coming into the office. The property was more leased than it was as of the first of the year. As of the first of the year, it's only 65% vacant. The operating expenses also are below what a stabilized occupied building would support. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, it's just among the board members. Okay, Mr. Matzkin.
let me throw, well, first, I think the parking income is just too inflated. It can't possibly be more than the high water mark in 2020. I mean, you could bring it down to that, you can just cut it in half, whatever, but I don't know why it's ballooning. That makes no sense to me. Much more importantly, however, is something that I want to throw out to the board. And that is that for 10 years, at least, these three buildings that are physically connected but have three different addresses have dissuaded full-time tenancy. Either they say, we'll only write a lease for the next, depending on the date, year and a half, 2 years and 1 month or something, some date certain at the end of some year, or we'll give you a 5-year lease, but we reserve the right to ask you to move with 9 months notice, 12 months notice. So this has been up in the air for a long time. It hasn't changed at all. So my question to the board is it reasonable to assume below the line that the landlord may pay real money in tenant improvement allowances in order to accommodate people who they think are only going to be there 2 years, 3 years, year and 3/4? So I mean, that number of 5 million plus way overwhelms everything else in any column, certainly the parking income that I brought up specifically. I mean, this has been, and then again, this isn't a recent development. This is going on a very long time. And I understand it, and it's a perfectly fine business approach. But that now that we established that we're really using the income approach and not land and site plans and whatnot, I'd like to, I don't know that we can second guess a year from now. However, now, why it's my conundrum, do we want to say, well, it's always been that way, so next year it's going to be that way? We're not spending anything for TI, other than maybe paint and carpet, maybe, you know, which is $10 a square foot, 12, 15. Do we want to go predict the future? We're pretty loath to do that. So how do we want to handle that? Because that's a big number.
Okay. Mr. Lawson.
Yeah, hey, Ken, following up on what you just said, what I was tinkering with was taking the applicant's 22 million and then subtracting lesser numbers. For example, she has 2 years, and we've been consistently going with the 1 year. And then she has the 100 for tenant improvements, and maybe that ought to be cut in half. Does that make any sense, or is that not make sense?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Again, this is a very long-term decision by the owner to not spend a lot of money on tenant improvement allowance.
Right.
It's not, I mean, it's a trend way longer than 5 years that this appellant reasonably disagreed with in other statements, other cases, I'm sorry. This is kind of a mess. I just get nervous about projecting the future. They may turn around and say, my God, we're never going to sell this, we're never going to redevelop it, and we're going to start spending money on it next year, 2 years, 3 years from now. I don't know what to do. I'm just giving you facts.
I don't know, I guess because of that reason itself, that you don't know what's going to happen or what you're going to do with it. I think the below the line deductions are appropriate because that's what they would do.
We have to pretend that it's a normal thing.
How long has it been in this flux?
Easy 10 years. Easy.
Well, then let's.
The older I get, the shorter 10 years is, so it could be more than that.
What I heard was they have nothing in sight already at this time for redoing anything on this building or the other sites. And the site plan is not approved. So, I understand what you're saying about their attitude toward leasing and short-term or exits and how that's created the problem. But it could be this way for another 10.
Sure. I mean, they're never going to spend this kind of money on TI, but that's maybe we know too much.
Well, I mean, because of that, I don't think we can assume this. Okay, I think this is what they're going to do.
Yeah.
But I was looking also at the parking income.
Yeah.
I did as well.
And I used the number that they had for the previous year, I mean, for 2021. So it's a big deduction from, it's about $144,000 less in the income.
I was looking at that also, but I'm looking at what the appellant had for their 21. Their pass-throughs and their parking income, you're off almost $200,000. And the expenses are about the other way. I kind of thought they balanced out.
They're generous on expenses, you think?
Yes. So I saw that 200,000, 190,000 kind of offsetting itself.
Yeah, I did a little, something that's slightly different from what Mr. Penaranda did. I just took the 2020, I guess I should have used the 2021, but I used the 2020 parking income and deducted, that was only 66,000. But it's definitely not going to be at 192. And that kept out after the deductions below the line at 21,610, 212. But I would suspect Mr. Panaranda's number would be lower. Obviously.
Yeah, it comes up to 20,665,600. Yeah, I thought it was a little, just cut it all the way too, but yeah, I can go with that. Maybe.
Yeah, Mr. Lawson?
Yeah, what I did, because I looked at the NOI and I found that somewhat persuasive. So I tinkered with the below the line based on the appellate. I ended up at 17,338,510, and I'm just wondering if the group thinks that's too aggressive.
I think it is.
I do.
What was your tinkering?
Too aggressive.
What I did, Ken, is I took I made it 1 year for rent loss, and then I took the $100 a square foot and just halved it, because I think you had a good point. They're not going to fix up the space. But I base it on NOI because I think going to 2530 based on past just isn't there. But, you know, I guess I'm not going to get support. So, Jose, what was your figure? 20 something?
20,665,600.
Okay, I would be okay with that.
Yeah, I would too. I could live with that.
I don't think just too much.
Can the rest of you live with that number?
Yes.
I'm sorry?
Yes.
Yes. Mr. Hoffman?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, then, Mr. Penaranda, if you'd like to.
Okay, I'll move that we reduce the assessment to 20,665,600, and that's based on reducing the parking income to 2021 amount.
I'm sorry?
That's by reducing the parking income to the 2021 amount.
Okay.
It's good.
Okay. We have a motion and a second. Do we have a second?
Second.
Okay. Motion and a second by Mr. Metzgen. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Okay, it's unanimous. It's reduced to 20,665,600 based on using the county's column F and adjusting for the 2021 actual parking income. Thank you. Okay, next up on the agenda is RPC 1602102A, Economic Unit at 1001 Wilson Boulevard. Mr. Harmon, you can start with your 8 minutes and tell us about this property.
Yes, thank you. So this is 1001 Wilson Boulevard and 1701 North Kent Street, which are the London House and Normandy House apartments in Roslyn. These buildings are part of Roslyn Plaza and are at the easternmost portion of Roslyn. These apartments were built in 1965 and are 57 years old. As I'm sure you're all aware, this portion of Roslyn is relatively dreary, being as it is behind the more vibrant portions of Roslyn, and oddly situated at the bottom of a hill, which requires the property to navigate between 2 grade levels for the main level. This is not ideal for visibility or access. Now you can see that the property has suffered due to the poor market position if we look to the prior 3-year NOI reported by the property. NOI has dropped from 2019 to 2020, then again from 2020 to 2021. In 2021, NOI was only $2.9 million. The 2022 assessment imputes $3.3 million for NOI. How did the assessment arrive at a value that is so much higher than what the property has actually reported? The issues on appeal are the vacancy and collection rate and the deferred maintenance at the properties. First, I'd like to address column G on the DREA summary page on page 5 of the appeal. This column is titled Appellant Pro Forma. This was not submitted as part of the appeal. What was submitted on the appeal was a 2019, 2020, and 2021 operating history, the revised 2021 assessment, and the 2022 assessment. Since this is a multifamily property, we adhere to the dictates of Virginia law requiring actual income and expenses be considered when assessing this property. So if you look at column E and column G, the NOI comes out on column G to what the 2021 actual was. That's all that was submitted. Column G was not submitted on the appeal. The assessment imputes vacancy and collection at 8% of potential gross income. This is the guideline rate for this type of building in the county. However, when we look at the actual reported vacancy and collection loss at the property, we see that it was in fact twice the guideline rate. It was at 16% of gross potential income in 2021. What makes up the additional 8% in this vacancy and collection loss experienced at the property? Now, just briefly, vacancy and collection loss also includes rent loss. It includes concessions as well. So this is more, vacancy and collection is used to refer to the catch-all of all those items. It's also more akin to its economic vacancy and collection. It's not physical vacancy and collection. So if you look at CoStar on any particular date, that'll give you the physical occupancy and physical vacancy. That's different from the economic vacancy, which is the amount of income that was not earned at this property. So as I mentioned previously, these buildings are 57 years old. They are in a less desirable section of Roslyn. The combination of age, quality, and location make it difficult for these properties to compete with newer, higher quality, and better situated apartments along the RB corridor. This has necessitated that the property offer generous concessions to maintain occupancy. In 2021, concessions were over $300,000. This is 5% of gross potential income. The vacancy and collection rate at the property was an additional $600,000, and the rent loss at the property was nearly $100,000 in 2021. Combined, the concessions, vacancy, and collection and rent loss were nearly $1 million in 2021. The assessment only imputes $500,000 for these losses. Now, what the property reported in 2021 is important. This is important because Virginia Code Section 58.1-3295.1 requires that the actual income and expenses, including vacancy, collection losses, and rent concessions, be considered in the assessment of multifamily properties. What does this code provision mean to us here today? It means that multifamily properties need to be treated differently than other property types. The legislature felt strongly enough about using the actual income and expenses generated at multifamily properties to pass a law specifying that the actual income and expenses be considered and not just given token consideration. Why would the legislature go through the trouble of enacting this law if their intent was for multifamily properties to be treated the same as other property types, or even worse than other property types? So we have a law specific for multifamily stating that it must be treated in this specific manner, not just the same as any other property in the county. Yet what has the county done on the assessment? Instead of considering the actual vacancy, rent loss, collection loss, and concessions, the assessment has simply imputed a county-wide vacancy rate. Not only is this not giving consideration to the actual vacancy and collection loss, it is giving less consideration than the county gives to offices for vacancy and collection. When the county assesses offices, it uses a stratified frictional vacancy rate that is applied based on the actual vacancy, then allows a deduction below the line for excess vacancy. Here, the assessment simply applies the county-wide vacancy rate. Clearly, this manner of assessing multifamily properties fails to give adequate consideration to the actual losses attributable to vacancy, collection, rent loss, and concessions. If we capitalize the difference between the actual vacancy and collection reported at this property and the assessed vacancy and collection, we see that the assessment imputes $9.2 million in excess value to the property due to failing to adequately consider actual vacancy and collection loss. Now, presumably, the intent of passing this law is to ensure that multifamily assessments track the actual NOI generated by the property in order to keep rents in line with the value of property. Essentially, the legislature doesn't want multifamily assessments speculatively overvaluing multifamily properties to the detriment of residents who will ultimately pay the higher tax levied. Using the standard countywide vacancy and collection rate of 8% on this property ignores the actual rates contrary to Virginia law. The actual rate at this property was 16% in 2021. At this point, we may consider, uniformity requires us to apply this guideline rate. This is not the case. The Virginia Supreme Court has ruled that uniformity must give way in cases where it results in an assessment that is in excess of fair market value. That's exactly the situation we find ourselves in today. Next, the assessment fails to fully account for the level of expenses required to operate the property. If we look to the dollar value of the expenses, yes, the assessment is above what the property reported in 2021. However, the assessment also imputes gross effective income at a much higher rate than the property achieved in 2021. If we look to the operating expenses as a percent of gross effective income, we see that the property reported operating expenses at 43% of GEI in 2020 and 44% of GEI in 2021. The assessment only imputes expenses at 41% of GEI. Finally, these properties have significant deferred maintenance that needs to be completed. The property has an estimated $7.5 million in deferred maintenance as of the date of value. You can see an overview of these maintenance items on page 67 of the appeal, ground number 5. How do we value these costs? Since the Constitution of Virginia requires assessments to be at fair market value, and the Supreme Court has defined fair market value as the price a property will sell for in an arm's length transaction, we are directed to put ourselves in the shoes of a purchaser as of the date of value. When you're valuing this property to purchase, how would you value the $7.5 million worth of deferred maintenance? We have two options before us on how to handle this. We can ignore the deferred maintenance as the assessment does, or we can deduct these costs below the line as the appellant's pro forma column does. As the appellant's appeal listed on page 62 of the appeal does. As the county often states, Arlington assesses properties annually. If the deferred maintenance is completed, it will be reflected on the subsequent assessment. But in this case, the deferred maintenance needs to be deducted below the line to reflect how a market participant would value the property. So to recap, the NOI at the property has decreased over the past 3 years to just $2.9 million in 2021. Yet the assessment is at $3.33 million. The assessment arrives at this inflated NOI by failing to account for the vacancy, collection, rent loss, and concessions experienced at the property. The assessment also fails to account for the operating expenses that will be required to achieve the gross effective income imputed on the assessment. Finally, the assessment takes no consideration of the significant deferred maintenance present at the property. As such, taxpayer respectfully requests the assessment be reduced as set forth in the appeal. Thank you. And Eileen, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I do not. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Roskin for the county, please.
Okay, thank you. Excuse me. So taking a look at the summary sheet, when we received the new data for the 2021 INE, we did take a look at the rent that was being achieved at this property. And if you note that we, in column F, we used a lower rental income than what was being achieved for 2021. Yes, we have a stabilized vacancy rate of 8%. Now, keep in mind that when you look at the 2020, that's in line with 2020, but that's because that was the information that we had when we developed our stabilized vacancy. We didn't have the 2021 information when we came up with our guidelines for the year 2022. And then, you look down at the expenses, they're pretty much in line with what's being reported for 2021. When you're referencing column F, the revised column. As for the capital improvements, they did not report any capital improvements on the 2021. When you refer to the the capital improvement document that the appellant had submitted, and that 7.4 million is actually spread out over 9 years. It's not something they plan to do tomorrow or, this year or even, well, I take that back. They do propose to do a roughly 900,000 in improvements. And most of it is just a moderate priority. It's not, there's not that much that's a high priority. And so it's only 900,000 out of the 7.4 million that the agent is claiming. And once again, that 7.4 million is stretched over 9 years. This is a 1-year assessment. And also there's capital improvements, when a building is improved, that's reflected in the rent. Okay, so we looked at the rent. We offer a lower rent, and once again, we're using our stabilized vacancy and the a little more expenses than what they showed for the 2021. I'm open up for any additional questions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Questions from any board members? No? Okay, any final comments, Mr. Ruskin?
No, ma'am, I don't have any final comments.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Harmon, any final comments in your 1 minute?
Yes, thank you. So to go back to vacancy and collection, the county's response to the significantly higher, the double vacancy and collection that was reported in 2021 was, well, they didn't have that data initially. Well, they were provided that data on appeal. Upon receiving that data, it should have been considered. This is significant. It's required by law that we consider it and not just apply a countywide vacancy and collection rate. This results in $9.2 million once we capitalize the difference in actual vacancy and collection with the assessed rate. Even the 2020 rate cited by the county was 15% higher than the guideline rate. As to operating expenses, the county, at the level of income that they've imputed, the operating expenses that correlate with that are higher. You can see in the prior couple of years, as a percent of gross effective income, operating expenses in 2020 were 43%, 2021 were almost 44%. The assessment only imputes operating expenses at 41%. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, it's just among the board members. I just want to jump in first on one thing. I've said this in years past. I don't think I've said it this year. Many times we get hung up on these, percentages, 41%, 38%. But the bottom line is the number is more than what was reported in 2021. So I don't think the argument of it's, only using 41%, it's not high enough. The dollar amount more than covers what the actual expenses were. So I think kind of that gets into one of those same categories of you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't just use expenses. You got to look at the actual dollar or percentages. You got to look at the actual dollar number. So I don't know what you all feel, but I mean, I'm comfortable with what the revision is. Mr. Lawson?
Yes, ma'am. I looked at, I spent quite a bit of time studying the list of improvements. And at my condo, we just went through the roof and the building skin and the elevators, which, oh my gosh, it was so expensive. And, looking at it, I really didn't see that much that, would concern me from, we really got to do this or it's going to be a big problem. I saw some rebar exposed in the garage, things of that nature. I saw the building skin needs to be probably recaulked and so forth. So I don't think the expenses were really that great to impact. Then what I did is I kind of looked at, the bottom line, the NOI, and it's going up about 400 grand. Spread out over the amount of units, it's about 2,000 a unit, about 177 a month per unit. And I just don't think I think that's a reasonable assumption on the part of the county, that the NOI will go up by that amount because, like we've discussed in other cases, the residential not only has not been hit like the commercial and the office and the hotel, but it's actually benefited somewhat. So with you, Madam Chairman, I'm the same place you are. I'm okay with the revision.
Okay, other folks? Mr. Matzkin.
I'm going to step in it. I heard some reference to laws, and I'm trusting that I believe fully what the appellant suggested is the truth. And that would upset this assessment a lot if we were able and charged with interpreting laws and applying them. But I believe that we're charged with making sure that similar appellants are treated similarly based on the department's guidelines and standard operating procedures. If the appellant disagrees with what I've said, they are free to get the courts to apply the cited laws to the department. And I have no feeling one way or the other, who's right, who's wrong, how it ought to go. But I got to support the way everybody is treated as through, as I said, established department guidelines and SOP. But that could be a big deal if they're missing the boat legally. Somebody ought to challenge them on that. If not, then what I've said is of no use. So I therefore support the revised assessment. I like otherwise the way it was approached. That's it. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else? Mr. Panorama?
I'm okay with the revised assessment. I think your point, Ken, is, my understanding is the actual numbers have to be considered. It doesn't say they have to be used. So I think the county does look at it. They may consider sometimes to make adjustments based on that. But my understanding is that you're not obligated to use those numbers.
They're applying 8% vacancy, for instance. 8%. The appellant's saying it's way more than that, and there's a big gulf here. And the capital improvements, on the other hand, we could go on this for 20 minutes. Yeah. Well, sure, they're not going to spend all $7 million in 1 year, but the appellant says it has to do with fair market value. Who's going to pay it, knowing that they got to spend over the next couple of years $7 or $8 million? I mean, they're citing law. I just can't address that as a board member, but that could be a big deal. That could be slavish or significantly sensitive to fair market value considerations. And I could argue that, well, this is, as they described, it's deferred maintenance. They should have been spending this, and so we used to say back in the day, you don't get rewarded for bad behavior.
Okay, Mr. Lawson.
Yeah, the only thing I wanted to share, Ken, is that, if you do go to court, both sides are going to have expert witnesses. The judges are going to weigh the evidence, see who they think is most credible, see whose argument they think is best. And, we're obviously not in a position to act as judges. And there are cases where I think we do need to pay attention to precedent court cases, but I don't think in a case of this nature, we have to.
Oh, sure, agreed. And in fact, we did recently come up on the side of the court case.
On the recent sale case.
And that's not this, for sure.
Okay, any further discussion? No? Okay, then I'm going to move to accept the county's reduced number of 61,159,100. Do I have a second? Motion and a second by Mr. Lawson. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Okay, it's unanimous. It's reduced to the county's revised number of 61,159,100. Thank you. Okay, the last case on the agenda is RPC 1602602A at 1800 North Lynn. Due to the fact that the county just provided the appellant with additional information this morning, they didn't have time to review it. This case is going to be postponed and redocketed on Wednesday, October 5th in that agenda, and Rosa will send out an updated agenda for everybody sometime later today. But we'll just put that over there. And then obviously, Ms. Roskin, if you can provide that information to Rosa so she can send out the corrected information to the board as well.
I have already done so.
Okay, perfect. All right, that completes the agenda. Any business that anybody's got? Okay, then we will stand adjourned at 11:09 and re-adjourn next Tuesday, October 4th. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Board. Thank you, Karen.
Okay.